Hello, welcome to our presentation. This is Caitlin Coloma and Camille Carter. We will be discussing environmental and cultural factors for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. Certain types of media exposure have a significant correlation with engagement in the issue of sexual assault and domestic violence. Some are positive, while others are more negative portrayals. Rape is often envisioned as a dark alley crime committed by a lurking stranger. Portraying perpetrators as normal, everyday people and people who are often known to the victim provides a more accurate depiction. Abusers oftentimes are portrayed in the media as monsters, which can reinforce the idea that abusive behavior is identifiable and obvious. This is not always the case. A study done by Lee, Kim, and O'Boyle found social media has positive correlations with perceived issue importance, perceived risks, and involvement with issues at hand. It was found that other media channels, such as watching TV shows, news on television, and in the newspaper, was significantly correlated with increases in victim blaming, as well as reinforcing the ideas of victim and perpetrator myths. Victim myths are stereotypes perpetuated in the media, such as the victim exaggerating the seriousness of the sexual encounter, acting irresponsibly, such as drinking, flirting, dressing inappropriately, or outright lying. Perpetrator myths are presented when the accused perpetrator seems to be protected by the media with acceptable excuses. For example, when there is a claim that the perpetrator thought the incident was consensual sex. While the responsibility for domestic violence or sexual assault lies with the perpetrators of these crimes, we all play a role in creating a culture of respect and preventing violence. Family and peer support are extremely important for the best health outcomes for sexual assault and domestic violence survivors. Often, family and peer support is the first line of intervention to recognizing sexual assault and domestic violence is going on, and this can be key in getting help for these individuals. Family and peers should listen without judgment or blame, believe the victim, and support their decisions. While both family and peer support are essential, there may be times when certain peers or family members may not be the best support system for an individual. For example, the perpetrator of the crimes of sexual assault and domestic violence against an individual may not be the best form of support for that person. Sexual assault and domestic violence can be very closely related. Sexual assault in a relationship often occurs alongside other forms of abusive behavior. The majority of individuals who are physically assaulted by an intimate partner have been sexually assaulted by that same partner. Domestic violence often follows a repeating cycle consisting of three phases: the tension building phase, the abusive incident, and the honeymoon phase. The tension building phase is often described by survivors as a feeling of walking on eggshells around the abuser. This phase involves the building of tension leading up to the next stage, the abusive incident. This is when the straw finally broke that camel's back and the abuser now physically lashes out at the victim. Abuse comes in many forms, but examples of abuse that could occur in this phase include when the abuser hits or rapes the victim. The honeymoon phase follows the abusive incident and typically involves the abuser apologizing, buying gifts, or being extra affectionate to make up for the abuse. The abuser typically promises to change or promises to stop or makes promises that it will never happen again. These promises are given with the intent to persuade the survivor to stay in the relationship. After this phase ends, the cycle starts over again. It's also important to note, children that are abused physically and sexually are twice as likely to be abused or offend as adults. It's a cycle of violence that can be passed on from generation to generation. Law enforcement and courts play an important role in helping survivors escape violence and bringing abusers to justice. This includes the investigation of domestic violence and sexual assault cases, promoting deterrence, and assisting survivors in interrupting the continuation of violence. The vast majority of perpetrators will not go to jail or prison. Out of every 1,000 rapes, 995 perpetrators walk free. 230 are reported to police, 46 reports lead to arrests, 9 cases are referred to prosecutors, and 5 lead to felony convictions. This can be discouraging for victims and can lead to fewer reports to law enforcement on an already underreported crime. It is extremely difficult to prosecute sexual assault and domestic violence cases due to there oftentimes being a lack of physical evidence and a lack of witnesses. The majority of domestic violence cases usually happen in the privacy of one's own home. Survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence face many barriers that may make them more vulnerable in the community. Some of these barriers include fear the perpetrator will cause serious harm or death to themselves, their children, or pets. A lack of resources, financial resources such as money, transportation, childcare, employment, food, clothing, housing, healthcare, and insurance. Community resources such as shelters and services. Personal resources such as the skills needed to support themselves and their kids. And social resources, which are support from friends and family. So a lack of any of those things can be a barrier to making this population more vulnerable. Also, feelings and beliefs are a barrier. Not wanting to let go of that happily ever after idea with their spouse, low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, guilt, and shame as a result of abuse that undermines confidence to report or leave the situation. Survivors often feel embarrassed, ashamed, and fear being blamed. Despite the fact that they have been victimized and injured, they worry that they will be judged and held responsible for what happened to them. We must come together as a community, remove stigmas associated with sexual assault and domestic violence to help these survivors gain control and heal. Sexual assault and domestic violence is present in regions all around the world. Globally, as many as 38% of murders of women are committed by a male intimate partner. Domestic violence and sexual assault cause serious short- and long-term physical, mental, sexual, and reproductive health problems around the world. Other problems related to domestic violence and sexual assault occurring around the world include female genital mutilation prevalence. More than 200 million females in 30 countries have undergone female genital mutilation. It's especially common in the Middle East and Africa. And human trafficking, modern-day slavery involving the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. There's a high number of individuals affected by human trafficking all over the world, but there is a higher prevalence in Russia and China.
Health disparities. Socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status can greatly affect this population and the health outcomes of survivors of both sexual assault and domestic abuse, because if the victim is financially dependent upon their abuser, it makes it harder for the victim to support themselves and to live on their own. Some other ways that this can affect this population is they may have a lack of resources, a lack of financial support, as I mentioned, unemployment. This can be due to injuries, due to controlling nature of the abuser. This can also be due to mental health conditions that arise from the difficulties that this population faces. They also may be unable to afford proper care or treatment due to the lack of financial support they may experience. And socioeconomic status can also affect this population just due to the controlling nature of an abuser in cases of domestic abuse. They may not be able to have access to the funds that they need and the resources that they may need to maintain a healthy life. Race and ethnicity. Although domestic abuse and sexual assault do not discriminate, research showed that certain races and ethnicities are more susceptible to domestic abuse and/or sexual assault. So according to the NSVRC, I found that certain races mentioned here, Black, Hispanic, white, and then Asian, are more prone to domestic abuse situations. As far as sexual assault goes, I was not able to find statistics on certain victim races. Victims can be anyone, as well as domestic abuse. But research did show that perpetrators typically follow into these races right here. I found that 57% are typically white, 27% are typically Black, and then the other 8% were unknown races. And I also found that no matter what the race was, both instances of domestic abuse and sexual assault, alcohol consumption increased these instances of occurring in many types of different races. Religion. Religion can affect health outcomes in many different ways amongst this population. It's definitely dependent upon the religion. There are many different religions, and the health outcomes can be affected in many different ways. For example, what one may consider sexual assault or domestic abuse may not be considered as such in different religions. Religions may definitely provide a sense of support to victims. They may provide shelter. There's a lot of resources that they do provide to people. They provide support, a sense of service, and shelter. Community-based advocacy was one that I found in empowering others and just providing that social support that these individuals may need. Gender. According to the CDC, I found that on average, 16.9% of females experience sexual assault or domestic abuse or abuse in their lifetime, whereas about 8% of men experience sexual assault or abuse in their lifetime. So, with that being said, gender can affect the health outcomes of this population because females may be a little bit more susceptible to being a part of this population. Geographical location. Geographical location can affect this population in many different ways, especially if the victims are living far away from treatment centers or they're unable to seek care. This greatly affects health outcomes because these individuals may not be able to travel far distances, especially in victims of domestic abuse and sexual assault, where they may have an abuser and they may not be able to do a lot of things independently. So the way that telehealth and telemedicine could improve these conditions is that it allows these individuals to have more independence. They're able to remotely seek counseling and care, not only physical care, but a lot of times these individuals need mental and spiritual counsel and guidance and support. So telehealth and telemedicine reduce these barriers by making care and counseling more easily available. Implicit and explicit biases. So a few examples, starting with implicit biases. These can often be negative preconceived notions or assumptions about a certain population, and this is kind of like a subconscious bias that oftentimes people are unaware of. So assumptions amongst this population may include things such as, oh, these people can just help themselves. Oh, these people can just leave abusive relationships, or maybe they were sexually assaulted because of what they were wearing, or certain biases and conclusions and assumptions like that. Whereas explicit biases, individuals are aware of these biases and they often state them directly. So instead of implicit biases where people may think, oh, well, they can just help themselves, explicit biases can include reaching out to victims and survivors because of the knowledge they have of the difficulties that this population may face, and or they know of resources or support groups. Regions. Disparities according to region. I was not able to find a solid statistic that indicated whether certain types of regions throughout the world had more instances of either sexual assault or domestic abuse. However, I did find in research that this is a worldwide issue. Sexual assault and domestic abuse do not discriminate, and they can occur to anyone at any time throughout the entire world. A very important thing that needs to occur in order to decrease instances is to speak out against both sexual assault and to really create awareness and let these individuals know that there is help out there, even if it is hard for these individuals to realize at the time. And it's very important, especially as healthcare workers, to report it if you see anything that seems out of the normal, or you might recognize that domestic abuse or sexual assault has happened. Here are references, and references continued. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.